So as Russia continues to triple down on the foolish policies of continuing this war in Ukraine, the state of their country is eerily becoming more and more reminiscent of the Soviet Union just before their collapse in 1991. But not entirely. And I'm going to cover where contemporary Russia is both similar and different than the Soviet Union just before their collapse. However, the differences between the two may not be a good thing for modern day Russia. So much like the Soviet Union, Russia faces political isolation and declining influence globally, especially over former Soviet states. Countries like Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and the Baltic states have distanced themselves from Moscow, reducing Russia's sphere of influence. Even historically closer allies like Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan are adopting anti-Putin stances and shifting away from Russian dominance. Former allies are pursuing partnerships with other global powers such as the United States, the European Union, and China, which is undermining their regional leverage. Even Russia's fellow Collective Security Treaty Organization members are reaching out to the United States to conduct military deals. See Armenia. Approval ratings for Russia have plummeted across former Soviet republics, with symbolic and practical support for Ukraine emerging as counters to Russian aggression. 4 former Soviet countries have banned symbols that support Russia's war, and Russia faces increasing diplomatic hostility, which mirrors the decline in legitimacy of the USSR in its final years. The ruble's devaluation and inflationary pressures echo the economic collapse of the late 1980s and the early 1990s in the Soviet Union. Sanctions and high costs of this war are straining Russia's economy, just as the arms race strained the Soviet Union. Countries like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan are rerouting energy supplies away from Russian infrastructure, reducing Russia's economic leverage. Russia's diminishing ability to use energy exports as a global tool mirrors the loss of centralized economic power during the Soviet collapse. Widespread dissatisfaction with Putin's policies reflects the social discontent within Russia, which is very similar to the situation that led to the downfall of the Soviet Union internally. Russia has overextended itself in Ukraine, with massive military casualties and seemingly prolonging this conflict in Ukraine indefinitely, which is reminiscent of the USSR's overextension in Afghanistan, which drained resources and morale. The rising cost of this war in Ukraine exacerbates domestic and economic problems in Russia. The Kremlin is also making further territorial claims in other former Soviet republics yet again, and this is fueling nationalist movements in those countries, leading to strong pushback against the Kremlin's claims. And such movements are bleeding into Russia. Similar to the Soviet collapse, Russia is experiencing social and economic stressors that are eroding public confidence in their government and the government's stability. This is leading to regional fragmentation as local governments are growing increasingly worried the Kremlin will not be able to support their people. This is very similar to the disintegration the Soviet Union faced as their central authority lost legitimacy. Putin's increased isolation and reliance on unpopular strong-arm strategies echo the waning legitimacy of Gorbachev and the inability of the Soviet leadership to adapt to changing realities. However, the current situation in Russia is also presenting a different scenario than what the Soviet Union faced. And for contemporary Russia, the differences are actually worse. Unlike the Soviet Union, which was largely insulated from global trade due to its command economy, modern Russia is heavily integrated into the global economy. So sanctions imposed by Western nations over Ukraine that targeted critical sectors including energy, finance, manufacturing, and technology are significantly more painful than anything the Soviet Union faced. Contemporary Russia faces far more import and export reductions than the Soviet Union ever faced. The Soviet Union still had access to energy exports even during the worst of times, but Russia has now lost its ability to use oil and gas as a geopolitical weapon as countries in Europe and Central Asia have diversified their energy sources away from Russia. They can do this because of the rise of alternative energy suppliers such as the United States and the Middle East, who are willing to provide additional support. Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan have already rerouted pipelines away from Russia, and Europe's reduced reliance on Russian energy has undercut Russia's energy economy more profoundly than the Gorbachev era. Interestingly, Russia's economy is actually less diversified right now than the old Soviet Union was. Russia relies heavily on natural resources because manufacturing is just done better in other countries around the world at this point, and largely, much of that can be attributed to the rise of China. Now, the devaluation of the ruble and rising inflation have hit ordinary Russians hard, creating economic instability that actually surpasses the hardship of the late Soviet period, especially among the lower classes. Because the USSR did not face the kind of interconnected financial systems and global markets that modern Russia relies on, the Soviets were less integrated and had a more stable internal economy. So anything that happens to Russia from an external standpoint has much more of an impact now. In the late 1980s, the Soviet Union retained influence in Eastern Europe and other socialist bloc nations, as well as among developing countries throughout the world, even in South America and Asia, due to the ideological appeal of communism. In contrast, modern Russia has seen all but a few of its allies drift away. Apart from Belarus and pretty terrible countries like North Korea and Iran, as well as limited tacit support from figures like Hungary's Viktor Orban, Russia's diplomatic and ideological influence has waned dramatically, and that's because politically they have nothing to offer. They are not the same as the Soviet Union, who exported a communist ideology. And this is leaving Russia far more isolated than USSR ever was in its final years. The Soviet Union was seen as a peer to the US back then. Modern Russia is barely a peer to France. Earlier I spoke about the Soviet-Afghan War as a major factor in the downfall of the Soviet Union. Well, that war lasted about 10 years and resulted in 65,000 Soviet casualties. Russia recently passed 800,000 casualties in Ukraine, and we are only in year 3. All of this is causing discontent within Russia, and the amount of domestic uprisings we are currently seeing in Russia far exceeds what the Soviet Union saw. Acts of civil resistance, regional dissent, and growing separatist sentiments in both the metro areas of Moscow and St. Petersburg, as well as ethnically separate regions like Chechnya and Dagestan, are growing. The Soviet Union had a firmer grasp on their media as well, because all that was around was TV. Modern digital communications allow grievances to spread rapidly through the internet and smartphones, despite attempts to censor them, which accelerates unrest at a faster pace in current Russia than the Soviets ever could have dreamed. The Soviet Union had more control and broader structure of governance that could absorb shocks and control the narrative much more effectively. Because of Russia's hyper-centralized state now, with Putin essentially concentrating power entirely within him, any physical absence that he has creates a leadership crisis that further destabilizes the country. We always see it. Where's Putin? Where's Putin? He has to show face periodically in order to remain the strongman. So while the Soviet Union faced monumental challenges in its final years and still ended up collapsing, modern Russia's crises are compounded by greater economic reliance on external factors, greater technological dependency, and less diverse leadership. Their war in Ukraine is worse than Afghanistan. They have fewer allies and less global influence, and domestically, they have less control. It took decades for the Soviet Union to reach the point of collapse. So when we talk about the Russian collapse, it may not be soon, but it's going to happen, because all of what I've just said points to a collapse that will likely be more severe than that of 1991.